About a third of everything the world ships by sea passes through one patch of ocean. This patch, right here. We're talking trillions of dollars worth of goods every year. Oil tankers, container ships stacked with electronics, car parts, furniture, food. If you bought something today that was made in Asia, and you probably did, there's a decent chance it sailed through these waters. The South China Sea is not a big ocean. Roughly 3.5 million square kilometers, hemmed in by China to the north, Vietnam to the west, the Philippines to the east, and Malaysia and Brunei to the south. And scattered across the middle of it are the Spratly Islands. These are about 100 tiny specks of reef, rock, and sand, most of them barely visible above the waterline at high tide. For 6 decades, 6 different governments have claimed overlapping pieces of this archipelago. China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan, all of them insist that these reefs and sandbars belong to them. All of them building small outposts, planting flags, and occasionally ramming each other's boats. But then, around 2013, China decided to settle the arguments with some concrete. Over the next 3 years, fleets of massive dredging ships descended on 7 reefs in the Spratlys. They vacuumed up sand and crushed coral from the seabed, pumped it onto submerged reefs, and kept pumping until solid ground emerged from the waves. By the time they were finished, China had created roughly 3,200 acres of new land. That's about 1/5 the size of Manhattan, built from scratch, in the middle of a contested sea. The US Navy's Pacific commander at the time, Admiral Harry Harris, had a name for it. He called it, appropriately, the Great Wall of Sand. But sand, that was only the beginning. On those artificial platforms, China built military bases. 3 of the islands now have runways over 3,000 meters long. That's 30 football pitches laid end to end, long enough, importantly, to land heavy bombers. They've got deepwater harbors, radar arrays, missile shelters with retractable roofs, underground ammunition storage, and hardened aircraft hangars. Satellite photos show fighter jets parked on the aprons, anti-ship missiles pointed out to sea, surface-to-air batteries ready to light up anything that flies a little bit too close. These are, on paper, kind of unsinkable aircraft carriers, if you will. Permanent platforms projecting Chinese military power across one of the most strategically important waterways on Earth. And that is exactly what Beijing wants you to see. What's harder to see from satellite photos is everything that makes these island fortresses deeply and fundamentally fragile. They are exposed to some of the most powerful typhoons on the planet. They sit within range of cruise missiles, stealth aircraft, and potentially hypersonic weapons from 6 different countries. They depend on supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers across open water. They rest on dredged sand over dead coral, and an international court has already ruled that China has no legal right to most of the waters that they are supposed to be controlling. Despite how impressive the engineering might be, we are on the Mega Projects channel. I am building new studios. Eventually. This video is brought to you by our longtime friends over at Squarespace. Look, if you've ever wanted a clean, professional place for a project, I don't know what that might be, your personal website, business website, whatever, you should make it with Squarespace. It's just the best way to go. It's the way I do things. It's the way you should do things. It's the way that people with giant brains do things. I've used Squarespace for years. It removes a ton of friction. You're not duct taping like a bunch of random tools together. I don't know what those tools do. I don't know how they work. That's why I use Squarespace. They've got design tools, which make everything super easy. They've got Blueprint AI, so you're not starting from scratch. And then you just add your text and you drag and drop, and boom, you are done. It's ridiculously easy. Plus, they've got SEO and analytics built in, so you don't have to think about it. Plus, you can send newsletters. Plus, you can paywall stuff. Did I say newsletters? I just said newsletters. You could do stores. That's the other thing. It's fantastic. If you want to try it, all you need to do is go to squarespace.com/megaprojects for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, use the code MEGAPROJECTS to get 10% off your first website or domain. And now back to today's video. These gleaming fortresses might be the most expansive mistake that China has ever made. Why build islands at all? Alright, so why did China build these islands? If you look at a map, China has a long coastline, but almost every shipping route to and from that coast funnels through narrow choke points controlled by other countries. The most important one is the Malacca Strait, a skinny channel between Malaysia and Indonesia, barely 65 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Around 80% of China's imported crude oil passes through that strait. Chinese strategists have a name for that vulnerability. They call it the Malacca Dilemma. And in peacetime, it's fine, no worries. In a crisis, if hostile navies decided to squeeze that choke point, China's economy would start suffering within weeks. The South China Sea sits at the other end of that funnel. Control those waters, and you've got options. Lose them, and you're at someone else's mercy. Now, China has claimed most of the South China Sea for decades. Since 1947, Chinese maps have shown a U-shaped boundary called the Nine-Dash Line that sweeps down from the mainland and curves around to enclose roughly 90% of the sea. This claim is based on what Beijing calls historic rights, the idea that Chinese fishermen and traders have used these waters for centuries, and, well, that makes the whole region Chinese territory, according to China. Other countries, unsurprisingly, disagree. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all have overlapping claims. And under international law, specifically the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, most of these waters are either international or belong to the coastal states whose shores they lap against. For a long time, this dispute simmered, never really boiling over, but then things changed. First of all, it's about resources. Geological surveys suggested the South China Sea might hold around 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, which is, that's a lot. The fishing grounds were already worth billions annually, but suddenly these scattered reefs mattered economically. Really a lot, and not just symbolically. And second of all, the strategic picture changed a lot. By the 2000s, the United States Navy was the dominant force in the Western Pacific. American carriers could sail wherever they pleased. For a rising China with ambitions to become a maritime great power, well, that just wasn't acceptable. China had maintained small outposts on some spratly reefs since the 1980s. Concrete platforms on stilts, a few soldiers, that sort of thing, nothing really very serious. Then things escalated. In 1995, the Philippines discovered that China had quietly built structures on Mischief Reef. Well named, well inside what Manila considered its exclusive economic zone. The Philippines protested, China shrugged, and basically said, "Hey, what you gonna do about it, mate?" And in 2012, Chinese and Philippines vessels faced off at Scarborough Shoal, a reef about 200 kilometers from the Philippine coast. After weeks of tension, Chinese ships established control and never left. And we'll come back to Scarborough later. By the time Xi Jinping consolidated power in 2012 and 2013, the pattern was clear. Small, little, unilateral moves and deal with the consequences later. But then came a big decision. Rather than build one more platform on stilts, China was going to build land. Islands big enough for those airfields, those harbors, those radar stations, those missile batteries. Forward operating bases within fighter range of almost the entire South China Sea. The strategic logic was really straightforward. Extend your radar coverage, push your missile umbrella further from the mainland, create overlapping zones where enemy ships and aircraft face threats from multiple directions. Military planners call this anti-access area denial, making it so costly for an adversary to operate in your neighborhood that they think twice about showing up in the first place. On paper, the bubble looks great. It's really rather impressive. On paper. Engineering the Great Wall of Sand. So, building an island from scratch in the middle of the ocean requires three things: a starting point, a lot of sand, and an industrial fleet capable of moving that sand at an almost absurd scale. And, well, good news for China, if someone's going to be able to do that, it's China. They had all of that equipment. The starting points were the coral reefs. Most of the 7 spratly features China chose were low tide elevations, meaning they poked above the waterline when the tide went out, but disappeared again when it came back in. A few had small concrete platforms already, others were just underwater shapes visible from the air. The sand came from the seabed surrounding those reefs, and the fleet, well, let's talk about the fleet, shall we? China deployed some of the largest cutter suction dredgers ever built. The Tianjin Hao, for example, is 127 meters long with a dredging capacity of around 4,500 cubic meters per hour. These ships are essentially enormous vacuum cleaners. A rotating cutter head at the end of a long boom chews into the seabed, breaking up sand, sediment, and coral. Powerful pumps suck up the slurry and shoot it through pipes onto the target reef. The process runs 24 hours a day. And slowly, an island emerges from the waves. From December 2013 to October 2015, Chinese dredgers created roughly 3,200 acres of new land across 7 reefs. That's about 13 square kilometers, enough sand and crushed coral to fill tens of thousands of Olympic swimming pools. Subi Reef alone gained around 4 million square meters of land. Mischief Reef, when you include modifications to its lagoon, now covers more than 20 square kilometers of altered seabed. Once the sand settled, construction crews moved in. Bulldozers shaped the raw material into platforms. Engineers poured concrete foundations. Rock armor and seawalls went up around the perimeter to stop the ocean from reclaiming what the dredgers had built. And then the real infrastructure arrived. Take Fiery Cross Reef as a template. Satellite imagery shows a 3-kilometer-long runway. There's a large harbour carved into the reef, deep enough for naval vessels and supply ships, and dotted around the perimeter, structures that analysts identify as point defence positions, places for anti-aircraft guns and short-range missiles. Subi Reef and Mischief Reef follow almost exactly the same blueprint. The Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, which tracks construction using commercial satellite photos, has noted how remarkably standardized the design is across all 3 major bases. Same runway length, same harbor configuration, same defensive layout. Control-C, Control-V. What's harder to see from above is what's below. Satellite imagery shows entrances to underground storage facilities, ammunition bunkers, fuel depots built to survive bombardment. There are also garage structures with retractable roofs, shelters for mobile missile launchers that can roll out, fire, and roll back into cover. Recent Chinese engineering research has even proposed tunneling under these artificial islands to create additional protected space. Excavating through dredged coral sand is technically pretty challenging. The material is unstable, and groundwater intrusion is a constant problem. But the plans suggest that Beijing sees these bases as long-term investments that are worth hardening further. And all of this is on what used to be a living coral reef. China's island building campaign buried approximately 13 square kilometers of reef ecosystem under sand and concrete. Dredging operations destroyed coral structures across a much wider area. Chinese fishing fleets in the region have also harvested giant clams using techniques that gouge the reef surface, damaging over 100 square kilometers of coral habitat in the Spratlys alone. And this matters beyond just caring about the environment. Coral reefs are nurseries. Larvae drift on currents to replenish stocks across the entire South China Sea. Coastal communities in Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia depend on these fish for food and income. In 2016, an international tribunal at The Hague examined the evidence and ruled that China's land reclamation had caused severe harm to the coral reef environments. No shit. The tribunal found that China had breached its obligation under international law to protect fragile maritime ecosystems. Beijing rejected the ruling, and construction resumed, and nobody was surprised. Geographical and military vulnerability. Now, here's the thing about essentially an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It can't move. China's artificial islands have been described that way in official rhetoric and in admiring commentary. Fixed platforms that project air power without ever needing to return to port. But that's also a problem. A real aircraft carrier, if it detects an incoming missile salvo, can turn. It can accelerate or launch countermeasures and change course unpredictably while its escorts try to intercept threats. A Nimitz-class carrier can do over 30 knots, that's roughly 55 kilometers an hour, and the ocean, pretty big. Fiery Cross Reef does 0 knots. Every military on Earth with access to Google Maps knows precisely where it is, what's on it, and how to reach it. And a lot of weapons could reach it, as a matter of fact. The United States maintains substantial forces in the Western Pacific. Guam hosts B-52 and B-2 bombers. Japan-based F-35 stealth fighters can carry long-range missiles. US Navy submarines carry Tomahawk cruise missiles with ranges exceeding 1,600 kilometers. And those are just the established systems. The US has been testing hypersonic weapons designed to strike targets at speeds above Mach 5, far faster than any air defense system can reliably intercept. All of China's Spratly bases sit within range of these weapons. The neighbors have options too. The Philippines has begun acquiring BrahMos cruise missiles from India with ranges of around 290 kilometers, enough to reach Mischief Reef from Palawan. Vietnam operates modern Russian-made anti-ship and land attack missiles. Japan, South Korea, and Australia are all expanding their long-range strike capabilities. In military terms, the islands sit inside overlapping weapons envelopes. They can be hit from multiple directions by multiple countries using multiple systems, and unlike a carrier battle group, they cannot maneuver out of the crosshairs. This matters especially in the opening hours of a conflict. Wargame studies and strategic analyses consistently identify fixed high-value targets as top priorities for early strikes. Radars, air defenses, command centers, those sorts of things. The logic's straightforward. If you're trying to blind someone in a fight, you go for the eyes first. In this case, the eyes are radar domes sitting on concrete pads in the middle of the ocean. The air defenses are missile launchers in structures whose GPS coordinates are publicly available. A saturation attack, dozens or hundreds of missiles arriving simultaneously from different directions, could overwhelm defenses and crater runways before most aircraft ever got off the ground. Hardened shelters do offer some protection. Underground bunkers can survive hits that would destroy surface facilities, but a runway full of craters is useless regardless of how intact the hangars are. A harbour entrance blocked by a sunken ship is useless. A radar dome with a hole in it is also obviously useless. And even when everything is working perfectly, these bases have capacity limits. Fiery Cross Reef, the largest of the Spratly outposts, can accommodate around 24 fighter aircraft, plus perhaps 4 larger planes like patrol aircraft or tankers. That's the estimate based on hangar space and apron size. A Nimitz-class carrier, by comparison, typically carries 60 to 70 aircraft. A single US carrier strike group, in other words, brings more air power than all 3 of China's major Spratly bases combined. So yes, the islands extend China's reach, and yeah, they provide radar coverage and some missile deterrence, but in a serious conflict, they'd likely absorb massive damage in the first hours, and unlike a carrier, they can't then sail away for repairs. They are islands. Logistics and sustainment. Now, every military base needs supplies. Bases on the mainland get that stuff by truck, train, and pipeline. Bases overseas usually sit near allied ports and established supply chains. China's Spratly Islands get everything by ship or aircraft across hundreds of kilometers of open ocean from Hainan or the mainland. In peacetime, that is expensive and complicated. There's a constant rotation of supply vessels in and out. Every litre of jet fuel burned by a fighter on Fiery Cross had to cross about 1,000 kilometers of open water from the nearest major Chinese port. Every missile sitting in a launcher was shipped the same distance. Every bag of rice eaten by the garrison, every water purification filter, every roll of toilet paper shipped. And in peacetime, like we said, it's expensive, but it's fine. It rolls along nicely. In wartime, not so much. The supply routes run through waters that would be contested by submarines, surface ships, and aircraft from multiple countries. US attack submarines patrol these seas. The Philippines, Vietnam, and Japan all have anti-ship capabilities. Australia is acquiring long-range strike aircraft and submarines. The same overlapping weapons envelopes that threaten the islands themselves also threaten every vessel trying to reach them. Mines are another problem. A few dozen sea mines, scattered in the approaches to a harbour, can force ships to slow down for sweeping operations or risk catastrophic damage. Laying mines from submarines or aircraft is relatively easy, but getting rid of them is a nightmare. Even without active combat, a blockade or quarantine could strangle the islands over time. They have fuel storage, water tanks, and food stockpiles, but those run out eventually. A base that can't be resupplied is a base that slowly loses the ability to operate. And then there's the maintenance burden. Salt air corrodes metal, the humidity degrades electronics, and intense heat stresses concrete. South China Sea serves up all 3 of these constantly, and also it's got those periodic, pretty serious typhoons. And all of this has to be repaired constantly. Climate and typhoon risk. The northern South China Sea sits in one of the most active typhoon corridors on Earth. Every year, storms spin up in the western Pacific and track westward across the Philippines, the Spratlys, and toward the Asian mainland. Super Typhoon Regasa, which struck in late 2024, generated storm surges exceeding 3 meters along affected coastlines and forced mass evacuations across multiple countries. In 2013, Super Typhoon Haiyan, one of the strongest tropical cyclones ever recorded, killed over 6,000 people in the Philippines. Climate research shows these storms are getting worse. As ocean temperatures rise, typhoons draw more energy from the water. Studies of the South China Sea indicate that significant wave heights during major storms have been increasing, and storm surges are reaching further inland across low-lying coasts. Now, of course, picture what sits in the path of those storms. China's Spratly bases perch only a few meters above sea level. They're built on dredged sand and crushed coral, materials that compact and settle over time. The foundations rest on what used to be submerged reef structures, surrounded by deep water on all sides. When a typhoon approaches, natural islands at least have vegetation, root systems, and consolidated geology holding them together. These artificial platforms have seawalls, rock armor, and whatever reinforcement engineers could add after the dredging stopped. A 3-meter storm surge washing across a runway is a problem. 6-meter waves battering a seawall for hours is a bigger problem. Saltwater flooding electrical systems, ammunition storage, and aircraft hangars is an even bigger problem. And the storms keep on coming, year after year. Engineers have raised concerns of long-term subsidence, the gradual sinking of reclaimed land as the dredged material settles and compacts under its own weight. Repeated typhoon strikes accelerate erosion around the edges. What basically happens is China built airports on sandcastles and parked them in the path of ever-strengthening storms. The sandcastles, they're really good sandcastles. They're reinforced, they're strong. They've got concrete and steel and serious engineering behind them. My son would love this shit. But the ocean is real powerful. Legal and diplomatic blowback. In January 2013, the Philippines did something no country had ever done before. It took China to court over the South China Sea. The case went to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague, a body established to settle international disputes under frameworks like the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which both countries had signed. The Philippines asked the tribunal to rule on China's sweeping claims and its aggressive action around disputed features. China refused to participate, declaring the tribunal had no jurisdiction and boycotted the entire proceeding. The tribunal proceeded without them. In July 2016, it issued one of the most significant rulings in modern international maritime law. On China's historic rights claims, the 9-dash line, the tribunal was unambiguous. It found that China had no legal basis under UN clause for claiming historic rights to resources within that vast boundary. The 9-dash line, as a source of legal authority, was invalid. On the artificial islands themselves, the ruling was equally blunt. Several of the features China had built on, including Mischief Reef and Subi Reef, were legally classified as low tide elevations. That means they sit below the waterline at high tide. Under international law, low tide elevations cannot generate their own territorial seas or exclusive economic zones, regardless of what you build on top of them. Piling sand and concrete onto a submerged reef does not transform it into sovereign territory. Legally, Mischief Reef is still a submerged reef. China just happens to have put a massive airbase on top of it. The tribunal also addressed the environmental damage. It found that China's island-building campaign had caused severe harm to the coral reef ecosystems and violated China's obligations under UN clause to protect and preserve the maritime environment. China rejected everything. Foreign Ministry called it null and void. Officials declared that China would neither accept nor recognize the decision. Construction continued. But the ruling didn't disappear. You see, it gave the Philippines and other claimant states a legal framework to point to. When Philippine officials describe Chinese incursions, they can now cite an international tribunal that said those waters belong to the Philippines under UN clause. When the United States conducts freedom of navigation operations, sailing warships through waters China claims, it does so with the legal backing of The Hague's ruling. The ruling also helped justify a wave of new defense arrangements. The US and the Philippines expanded their Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, giving American forces access to more bases closer to the South China Sea. AUKUS, the security partnership between Australia, the UK, and the US, explicitly aims to strengthen deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. China has increased defense spending and loosened long-standing restrictions on military cooperation. All of this cites directly or indirectly China's behavior in the South China Sea. And it's here that there's another unintended consequence. Other countries started copying the strategy. Vietnam has been quietly but rapidly expanding its own artificial islands in the Spratlys. The Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative reported in 2024 that Vietnam had added more than 690 acres of new land to features it occupies, enough that it could soon match or even surpass China's total reclaimed land area in the archipelago. Vietnam's islands now have extended runways, new hangars, radar installations, and defensive positions. Taiwan has expanded its facilities on Ituaba. Malaysia and the Philippines have reinforced their own outposts. The Spratlys are becoming rather crowded with fortified artificial islands built by multiple countries, all of them vulnerable to the same storms and missiles, all of them sitting in overlapping claimed waters. Escalation. On the 17th of June 2024, a Chinese Coast Guard vessel rammed a Philippine Navy boat near 2nd Thomas Shoal. Video footage showed the collision, the crunch of hulls meeting, and the immediate chaos as crew members scrambled. A Philippine sailor lost a thumb. A few months earlier, Chinese Coast Guard ships had used water cannons on a Philippine resupply mission in the same area, high-pressure jets capable of injuring crew and damaging equipment. In another incident, a military-grade laser was aimed at a Philippine Coast Guard vessel, temporarily blinding some of the crew. These confrontations happen pretty regularly now. The artificial islands, of course, sit at the center of all this friction. Each base represents a massive investment of money, prestige, and political capital. China cannot abandon them without appearing weak, and the Philippines cannot stop resupplying its own outposts, including the rusting Sierra Madre at 2nd Thomas Shoal, without conceding Chinese dominance. Vietnam also cannot ignore encroachments near its own claimed features. But there's a deeper problem here, one that military strategists call crisis instability. Fixed, high-value military assets create pressure to act early in a conflict. If you've got expensive radars, aircraft, and missile batteries sitting on platforms that cannot move and cannot hide, you face an uncomfortable choice when tensions spike. Use them early before they're destroyed, and for China, that means pressure to launch aircraft and fire missiles before a preemptive strike craters the runways and wrecks the launches. For the US and its allies, that means pressure to hit those islands first to neutralize the threat before it can be used. Both sides know this. In a crisis, the side that waits might lose its most valuable assets. The side that moves first might trigger exactly the war everyone wanted to avoid. And you probably see the problem. Historian Alfred McCoy has described China's island bases as circles of steel and castles of vanity. Impressive on the surface, but strategically counterproductive, more likely to drag powers into conflicts than to deter a conflict. The islands were supposed to project stability and control. Instead, they've created a region where armed vessels face off almost daily, where a collision or a misread signal could cascade into something much larger. Humanitarian disaster potential. Okay, so Fiery Cross Reef has fuel storage tanks, ammunition bunkers, large aircraft hangars full of jet fuel and munitions. Mischief and Subi, they've got the same, remember the copy and paste. In peacetime, fine, manageable hazards. In wartime, they could become an environmental disaster. A cruise missile striking a fuel depot creates a fireball, a plume of burning hydrocarbons, and a slick of whatever doesn't burn spreading across the water. Ammunition bunkers, hit by precision strikes, scattered unexploded ordnance and chemical residue across the surrounding reef and the lagoon. Radar installations, generators, and vehicles all contain oils, lubricants, and toxic materials that would contaminate the maritime environment. The reefs beneath these islands, they are already very stressed, and this would make everything worse. And then there's the humanitarian angle. The people on the islands themselves. Hundreds of military personnel are stationed on each of the major bases. Some facilities also host civilian workers, construction crews, technicians, support staff. Exact numbers are difficult to confirm, but estimates suggest the garrisons on the big three islands each number in the hundreds. These people live on isolated concrete platforms in the middle of a contested sea. They endure tropical heat, humidity, and the constant salt corrosion that seems to just eat away at everything. In a conflict, evacuation options are limited, with aircraft having to fly through contested airspace. Ships would need to sail through waters filled with submarines and anti-ship missiles. The same supply lines that struggle to bring in rice and fuel in peacetime would become nearly impossible to traverse under fire. But now let's walk through a couple of scenarios. Scenario 1 would be the slow squeeze. Tensions between China and the Philippines continue to escalate. More collisions near 2nd Thomas Shoal, more water cannon incidents, a Philippine sailor may be killed in a confrontation. Accident or not doesn't really matter politically. Manila demands action. Washington reaffirms its treaty commitments, and the situation spirals. US Navy destroyers increase their freedom of navigation patrols. Australian and Japanese ships join exercises nearby. Philippine Coast Guard vessels shadow every Chinese supply mission. Commercial shipping companies Nervous about insurance rates and political risk, start routing container ships around the area rather than through it. China's supply lines to its island bases stretch thinner. Resupply ships now need escorts, destroyers, or frigates that could otherwise be deployed elsewhere. Aircraft flying to the island require fighter cover. Every mission burns more fuel, costs more money, and demands more coordination. The islands remain operational, but the expense of maintaining them climbs steadily, and every resupply run becomes a potential flashpoint. This could go on for months, even years. The islands slowly transform from strategic assets into liabilities, fortresses that demand constant resources to sustain, but can't be abandoned without losing face. And what about scenario 2, the opening hours? A crisis of Taiwan or a direct confrontation in the South China Sea escalates past the point of no return, and someone gets the first shot off. Military planners on all sides have studied this. Wargame studies consistently show the same pattern. Fixed, high-value targets get hit early. Within the first hours, cruise missiles and stealth aircraft would target radar installations and surface-to-air missile batteries across the region. The Spratly bases, with their prominent radomes and known defensive positions, would be priorities. After the strikes, what remains? Damaged infrastructure on an isolated platform, unable to project power, unable to receive reinforcement, waiting for a war's end that might be months or years away. Military analysts who have studied these scenarios tend to reach similar conclusions. China's artificial islands provide real value in peacetime: extended radar coverage, forward presence, coercive leverage. In wartime, they're just targets. The future. China's already working to address some of these vulnerabilities. Satellite imagery shows ongoing construction on several islands: higher seawalls, reinforced harbor structures, expanded underground facilities. And the logic's straightforward. If the surface is vulnerable, put more assets underground. If storms threaten, build the walls higher. Easy. Simple. Chinese researchers have also proposed installing floating nuclear power plants near the islands. These would provide reliable electricity without depending on fuel shipments, enabling more sophisticated facilities, desalination plants, and extended operations. The plans remain proposals for now, but they do signal how Beijing thinks about these bases: long-term, strategic assets worth major additional investment. Between 2013 and 2016, China transformed 7 submerged reefs into a network of military bases spanning the South China Sea. Massive dredges pumped millions of cubic meters of sand and coral onto features that barely broke the surface at low tide. Construction crews poured concrete, laid runways, installed radar systems, missile batteries, and aircraft hangars. As a feat of engineering, logistics, and political will, the Great Wall of Sand is genuinely impressive. No country has ever built anything quite like it. But those same qualities also define the project's vulnerabilities. The bases are immobile, they sit at fixed coordinates that every potential adversary knows. For now, the 7 reefs, transformed into fortresses sitting in a contested sea, waiting to see what storms, natural and political, the coming decade will bring. All we can do is wait and see. Thank you for watching.